Okay, the session is being recorded. What happened to my slides? No, that's not what I want. Okay, can you guys see the slides? Hope so. Yay. So anatomy and physiology. Now, of course, anatomy and physiology can cover a huge, broad scope of topics. I mean, nursing classes in Queensborough, it's 2 semesters, just the basics of anatomy and physiology. So you think we're going to be covering all of anatomy and physiology in about an hour's worth of online lecture? You think we can do it? Absolutely not. So all we're going to do is touch up on the basics and hopefully give you guys a little bit to go on your own accord. So first thing I like to do is, again, go over the differences between the terms anatomy and physiology. Anatomy refers to structure, location. Where is it? What does it look like? So it's important to know that the heart is a 4-chambered hollow organ, muscular organ that sits in the middle of the chest in a space called the mediastinum. Those are terms dealing with anatomy, whereas physiology refers to function. What does it do? How does it work? So it's important to know that when the heart's beating, the top 2 chambers, the atria, beat first, then the bottom 2 chambers, the ventricles, beat first. That electrical transmission is conducted from the top of the atrium throughout the muscle of the heart, relays in the middle of the heart, then works its way down the conduction fibers at the bottom of the heart. You guys will understand that a little bit more later on when we cover those type of material. So in any event, it's very important to have a somewhat fundamental knowledge of A&P, as I mentioned in day 1, because in order to understand diseases and injury patterns, you have to understand the organs and the organ systems that are being affected. And that's going to be even more so when we after the break when we talk about pathophysiology, the disease process, or how certain diseases affect organ systems. And it's just an introduction because we're getting more specific into that information as we discuss each medical and dramatic emergency. So first thing you need to know is how to describe things in terms of anatomic position and anatomic terminology. For example, if you ever had to move a sofa with a friend and carry it down a flight of stairs, do you ever tell your friend to move left and your friend moves left, but you meant your left and they thought they meant their left, and so instead of going left, they go right, and it causes a big accident and dropping of furniture and a whole shitload of arguments? Well, that's what happens if you don't communicate clearly where something is located on your patient's body. So when we talk about anatomic terminology, the first thing we want to know is what is our left and what is our right. Anytime you're talking about the left or the right, you always refer to the patient's left or right. Now, in order to refer to the patient's left or right, you have to assume what's called correct anatomic terminology. Now, you see this figure on the slide here. When you're talking about correct anatomic terminology, you're assuming the patient is standing upright, facing forward, hands rotated and palms facing forward, feet flat on the ground. Anytime you make reference to anything on the human body, you always assume that position. Now, look at some of the other terms we're going to talk about. So you see the left over here? That is your patient's left. Now, if you're looking at the screen, it's on your right, but it's on the patient's left. Whereas the right side is on the patient's left. If you take a sword and slice a line right down the middle of the patient's body, like Solomon's maybe, you have what's called a midline. So anything to the left of the midline, anything to the right of the midline. When you talk about anything going away from the midline, you use the term medial. I'm sorry, just mix that up. Anything towards the midline is medial. Medial almost sounds like middle, doesn't it? When you refer to something going away from the midline, you use the term lateral. You know, like when the quarterback throws a lateral pass to the side. So that's all in reference to the midline. Now, when you're talking about the extremities, anything away from the point of origin is considered distal. So the elbow is distal to the shoulder. The wrist is distal to the elbow. When you're talking about things going closer to the point of origin, you use the word proximal. So the elbow is proximal to the wrist. The shoulder is proximal to the elbow. Same thing with the lower extremities. the front of the body, the term is called anterior. The back of the body is called posterior. Some books, some references also use the term ventral and dorsal, like a dorsal fin of a shark. When you're talking about those terms, though, those terms are really more reserved for animal biology than it is for human anatomy. Human anatomy still uses the term anterior and posterior because we walk upright. Anything close to the head or approaching the head is referred to as superior. Anything going down to the feet is referred to as inferior. And so this slide pretty much teaches the same thing. When you dissect, please use them in a sentence. Okay. Superior and inferior. So we are talking about the terms superior, inferior. There's your sentence. Just kidding. So I'm just kidding. So good. So the head is superior to the shoulders. The pelvis is inferior to the chest. The chest is anterior to the spine. The wrist is distal to the elbow. The knee is proximal to the ankle. Does that make sense? Reread the recording. A couple of other terms that you need to be familiar with, and I don't have the slide posted up here, is if your patient is lying on the floor face up, they are in the supine position, face up. So rear end and back on the floor, face and belly pointing towards the ceiling. If they're face down on the floor, that is the prone position, So definitely practice and learn that anatomical terminology because you're going to need to answer questions on an exam and you're going to need to present a patient by using that anatomical terminology. So let's go over a little bit more about the human body, anatomy and physiology. And it's important to have a little bit of an understanding of the levels of organization. Now, if we were physicists, we'd be more concerned about things at the anatomic level, but we're not really at that point yet. We're going to start at the cellular level. A cell is the basic building block of life that you probably learned in 6th grade science. A cell is the smallest unit of something that can be considered an independent living organism. Now, you have organisms that are single cell entities like bacteria, but more often you have multicellular organisms like a plant, like an insect, like a dog, or like a human. So different cells coming together to perform a certain function are referred to as tissues. And there's 4 main tissue types in the human body. There is muscle tissue, I should say, which its sole function is pretty much just contract and move things throughout the body or move the body. And there's 3 types of muscle tissue we'll talk about later. There's cardiac, skeletal, and smooth muscle. Then another type of tissue is nervous tissue, which job is to conduct electrical impulses and send information throughout the body. Then there's connective tissue, which binds things together. It's cartilage, ligaments. And then finally, there is epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue, its function is to line hollow structures like the esophagus, like the mouth, like the heart, blood vessels. Epithelial tissue helps create borders, barriers, helps secrete chemicals into the empty spaces of the structure. It has a whole array of different functions. And there's something like 8 to 10 different levels of epithelial tissue, but we won't go that intense. Then different types of tissues coming together to form a structure with a particular function is called an organ. Think of any organ in the body, the brain, the heart, the kidneys, the pancreas, the liver, the gallbladder, the stomach, and you think about it. Your organs coming together to perform a particular function is considered an organ system. Cardiovascular system, the endocrine system, the musculoskeletal system. And then all those systems coming together makes up the organism itself, in our case, the human being. So when we talk about different emergencies, cardiac emergencies, endocrine emergencies, we're basically referring to the body and its human organ system. Every organ system is interdependent upon each other. And crucial for the survival of the organism, with the exception of maybe the reproductive system. Not necessarily crucial for the survival of the organism, but survival of the species, indeed. Now, the three most sensitive and important organ systems would be the nervous system, specifically the central nervous system, the respiratory system, and the cardiovascular system. You can't really live too long without either one of those systems working functionally and adequately. So let's start off by talking about the respiratory system. The respiratory system's job is to, one, introduce oxygen into the body to prepare the cells to metabolize and burn fuel for energy. And just as importantly, it's to release waste products from the body in the forms of carbon dioxide and water vapor. And the main structures of the respiratory system can be divided into the upper airway and the lower airway. The upper airway can contain structures such as the mouth, the nose, the back of the throat called the pharynx, the windpipe, otherwise known as the trachea. And then, depending on the textbook you read, usually about midway between the trachea, by the vocal cords, is where you separate the upper airway from the lower airway. And then the lower airway works its way down to the trachea, where it branches off into the left and right main stem bronchi, which are air passages that go into the lung itself. And then the bronchi themselves divide and divide and divide and split up until they split up into smaller passages called bronchioles, and then terminal passages called alveoli, which we'll talk about in a minute. And all those structures make up one of both lungs. So the lung would definitely be considered the lower airway. Yes, Nathan? So what borders the lungs and the lower airway is this oval, oblique, skeletal muscle that's called the diaphragm, which separates this area of the body from the lower area of the body, the chest cavity, or otherwise known as thoracic cavity, from the abdominal cavity, and the chest wall, which is composed of the ribs, the muscles between the ribs, and some membranes between the chest wall and the lungs called the pleura. What allows for the mechanics of breathing? What actually makes you able to grab air and pull it into your body? Well, two things happen. At rest, this muscle here is dome-shaped and concave up. When the body wants to take a breath in, this muscle, the diaphragm, will contract and flatten out, increasing the volume of the chest cavity. At the same time, these intercostal muscles will contract and pull the ribs out and up like a bucket handle. The two of these processes occurring stretch open the lungs and expands the area within the lungs itself. So as you're expanding that volume within a closed container, you're dropping the pressure within that container. So nature abhors a vacuum. So as that pressure within that container drops, it's just a natural property of physics that it's going to want to balance out. So that's where our air is going to be sucked in through the upper airway and into the lungs to balance out that pressure. And then when the body senses that enough air has been taken in, the opposite's going to occur. The switch is going to be cut off. The diaphragm is going to relax. It's going to spring back. The intercostal muscles are going to relax. They're going to spring back. The chest cavity is going to contract, and it's going to push air right out of the body in the process of exhalation. Now, what does that air do once it goes into the lungs? Well, once it passes through the upper airway, the mouth and the nose, the posterior pharynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, it goes to this terminal area called the alveoli. That's the end component of the airway. Now, the alveoli are billions and billions of little bubbly membranous sacs surrounded by billions and billions of tiny microscopic blood vessels called the alveoli. And what happens at the capillaries. And what happens at this level, the alveolar capillary membrane, oxygen is introduced and delivered to the alveoli. It passes into the bloodstream by a process called diffusion. It goes from high concentration in the alveoli to low concentration in the capillary. Just the opposite occurs with carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is at a high concentration in the capillary, and it's going to pass through and diffuse to where there's low concentration in the alveoli. And the constant change in pressure from the inhalation and exhalation is going to drive a pumping force to allow that to continue. So later on in the course, when we talk about different respiratory emergencies, we're going to talk about asthma, pneumonia, COPD, bronchitis, maybe even tuberculosis. And pick asthma, for example, very common respiratory disease that you'll come into contact with when you're out in the field. It involves a process of constriction of the bronchioles, making air exchange much more difficult, and swelling or inflammation of the bronchioles, which can even further inhibit the breathing process. And then we'll talk about how to recognize the signs and the symptoms of asthma and how to treat it at the EMT basic level. Next up is the cardiovascular system, another majorly important organ system, or otherwise sometimes called the circulatory system as well. And there's three major components to the cardiovascular system: the blood, the heart, and the blood vessels. And the function of the cardiovascular system is to transport oxygen and nutrients throughout the body to be delivered to each and every cell, especially the cells of the brain and the major organs, the liver, the kidneys, and so on, but every organ, so to speak. And just as important as delivering oxygen and nutrients to each and every cell of the body is the removal of waste products, carbon dioxide, water, and acids, throughout each cell of the body. The adequate delivery of oxygen and nutrients to each and every cell of the body is a term you're going to need to be familiar with. That term is called perfusion. Perfusion. Know that word intimately. Perfusion. We're going to talk about it a little bit later after the break. So one of the main organs involved with adequate perfusion in the body is the heart. The heart acts as a pump to physically transport the blood throughout the body. You don't have a working heart, you have stagnant blood that doesn't go anywhere, it doesn't do anything. The heart itself is a very powerful muscular organ. It's a hollow organ. It has 4 hollow chambers, 2 upper, 2 lower. The 2 upper chambers are called the atrium. The 2 lower chambers are called the ventricles. The upper chambers receive blood from the body. The ventricles push and ship out blood to the body. It's a dual chamber system. It works on 2 levels. The left side of the heart is called the systemic side of the heart, and it's going to pump oxygenated blood to all the cells of the body, whereas the left side of the heart is going to pump deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Once deoxygenated blood is pumped out to the lungs through the pulmonary artery into the lungs, it's going to pick up oxygen and it's going to bring oxygen back to the left atrium of the heart. Left atrium is going to receive blood that's been received from the lungs, been oxygenated. It's going to transport that blood into the left ventricle, where it's going to be pumped out to the rest of the body. As it's pumped out to the rest of the body, it's going to go to all the major veins, all the major venules, to each and every cell, and then that deoxygenated blood that's been used up is going to return to the right atrium. See the right atrium? Remember we talked about the left and the right? The right atrium is assuming the patient's right side, not your own right side. So the heart itself, it has a wider top and a narrower bottom. The top of the heart is called the base. The bottom of the heart is called the apex, sort of like an upside down and crooked pyramid. Not really like a pyramid, but you get the point. Now, the interesting thing about the heart is it's a very muscular organ, very active organ, and it constantly needs its own blood supply and oxygen. How does the heart get its own blood supply and oxygen? Through these blood vessels that wrap around the top of the heart called the coronary arteries. The coronary arteries are what feed oxygen to the heart muscle itself. And if those coronary arteries become blocked off, then that results in what we call a heart attack. Next component of the cardiovascular system is the blood vessels themselves. Now, your 3 major blood vessels are your arteries, your veins, and your capillaries. All arteries carry blood away from the heart. And as such, they are under a lot of pressure, and they're very muscular. And you can see an example of what an artery looks like on a cross-section diagram right here. All veins, one minor exception, bring blood back to the heart. And the blood and veins are usually under very low pressure. As a matter of fact, the pressure is so low that to keep blood from going backwards in veins, you need these structures within the veins called valves, which prevent backflow of blood. And then you have capillaries, which, as the artery is transversing away from the heart, it splits up, it splits up, it splits up, kind of like the branches of a tree, and turns into smaller arteries until we get what's called arterioles. And then finally, the arterioles split up so narrow that they're only one blood cell wide. At that point, they're called capillaries. And at the capillary level is where you have diffusion of oxygen nutrients into the cell and diffusion of carbon dioxide and waste products out of the cell. Now, anywhere that an artery comes close to the surface of the body, you can actually feel the pulsation, and we call that a pulse. Now, I'm sure many of you already know how to feel your radial pulse, maybe your carotid pulse. If you took a CPR class in the past, you probably learned how to check for the carotid pulse. There are different pulses in the body we'll learn about later on when we do patient assessment. The carotid pulse is found in the upper neck. The femoral pulse is found in the hip, the radial by the wrist, and so on. We're not going to get too much into detail there. So later on, when we talk about vital signs and learning about blood pressure, one of the most important ways of determining the effectiveness of the cardiovascular system at our level is knowing how to determine and take a proper blood pressure. Blood pressure is the measure of the pressure exerted by the blood on the walls of the arteries. And it's a component of a few factors that we'll talk about in a few minutes. So we talked about the blood vessels, and then finally there is, I said the heart, the blood vessels, and finally there's the blood itself. The blood itself has four major components. It has white blood cells, which are called phagocytes, which there's about 5 different major types of white blood cells, all basically share the same purpose, is to engulf and destroy foreign material, including bacteria, viruses. The red blood cells, called erythrocytes, whose job is to carry oxygen into the blood. Oxygen cannot diffuse into liquid very easily. You need some type of medium or some type of transport to bind onto it and carry it through. That's what your red blood cells do. Platelets are the part of the blood that help coagulate or clot it to keep you from bleeding to death if you cut yourself shaving. Well, they also the problem when you clot inadequately and you have a heart attack or a stroke. And then finally, the liquid, or the major portion of the blood, is called the plasma. 99% of it's water. But also in the plasma, you also have some proteins, which give it some texture and shape, and some charged particles called electrolytes, sodium, potassium, to name a few. So again, we talk about the importance of this term perfusion, the adequate delivery of oxygen nutrients to each and every cell. If any of those components of the cardiovascular or the respiratory system fail, then we get a term called hypoperfusion. The prefix hypo refers to decreased or less. Perfusion, we just talked about. Hypoperfusion is really just a fancy word that we probably more so know as shock. You may have taken a first aid class and learned a little bit about shock. It's how the body presents when the major organs are not getting properly perfused. The patient will be cold and clammy. You may notice an increased heart rate, increased respiratory rate. You may complain of thirst, nausea, vomiting, maybe a little bit of agitation or altered mental status. And at the really late stages, decrease in mental status, loss of consciousness, and ultimately death if it's not corrected. We will eventually talk about another fail. Marilyn cannot hear me. Can anybody else hear me?
I can hear you.
There goes that possessed robot again. It's really weird. Okay, Marilyn, maybe you want to reboot. Okay, so let's go a little bit more about the cardiovascular system. One of the major things we're going to talk about as far as the cardiovascular system goes is something called acute coronary syndrome. What the layperson would call a heart attack. It's much more involved than we think. And it all has to do with inappropriate clotting and disease of the blood vessels of the heart. So the next organ system, major organ system to talk about, is the nervous system. Now, the nervous system is probably the most important organ system because all the other organ systems work to serve the nervous system. And as you can see, the complexity of the nervous system, there's many different structures, many different organs, many different accessory organs that are involved in the nervous system to control the daily activity of the human body. And you have about, when's your next? Yeah, you're going to have to memorize about 80% of this chart for your next exam in order to be successful. And you just take it little by little and you'll be okay. No, I am only kidding. Don't worry about that. You do not have to memorize this chart, please. You know that by now. But you do have to know a few things about the nervous system. You need to know how to subdivide it into its two major components. The central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system, which consists of the peripheral nerves. Pretty much, yeah. I mean, when you talk about, and most specifically, every organ system is really designed, with maybe the exception of the reproductive system, like I said, to serve the central nervous system. When the body starts going into failure, when it's getting diseased or there's major injury, the body will sacrifice almost every organ system in order to save the nervous system. When we talk about head injuries and neurologic emergencies, it'll make a little more sense when we talk about that. Okay, so the basic building block of the nervous system is this little structure here called the neuron, or the nerve cell. It's almost like we could think of as a little mini microprocessor. That's about the extent of my computer knowledge, by the way. So the neuron has three major components. It has these little, almost like antenna projections called dendrites, and those are meant to receive information from adjacent structures. The cell body here, the nucleus, is really what processes information from nerve cell to nerve cell. And then that information is going to get transmitted to another adjacent structure, whether it's a nerve cell, a gland, or a muscle, through the structure called the axon, where it terminates into these little bulbous structures called the axon terminal, releases a chemical called a neurotransmitter, and stimulates that next adjacent structure to elicit a prescribed response. If it's conducting to a muscle, it's going to tell that muscle to contract, or it's going to tell that muscle to relax. If it's adjacent to a gland, it's going to tell that gland to secrete a hormone, or to stop secreting a hormone. Or if it's adjacent to another nerve, it's going to carry on that message to another nerve, to maybe spread it out along a different area, or to do another response. The possibilities are endless. So we talked about the anatomic differences. You have the central versus the peripheral nervous system. When you talk about the response of the physiology of the peripheral nervous system, you have to have a little understanding of the autonomic nervous system, or what we kind of refer to as the automatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is involved with most of your voluntary reflexes, your voluntary processes, where the autonomic nervous system regulates things that are not really under conscious control. And there's two subdivisions to the autonomic nervous system. There's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The sympathetic nervous system, some of you may have already heard about, is your fight or flight mechanism. It's to prepare you for areas of real or perceived danger, to get you the hell out of there or to help you fight it off. What's going to happen when your sympathetic nervous system kicks in? Your heart rate's going to increase, your blood pressure is going to increase, your pupils are going to dilate, you're going to have an increased level of awareness. Your digestion is going to kind of shut down because it's not really important to digest a steak right now. So you may feel nauseous. Those are all things that happen when you're nervous, right? But you can't live in that state forever. You have to have some type of braking mechanism, and that's where your parasympathetic nervous system kicks in, or your feed or breathe nervous system. It's going to bring the heart rate back down, decrease your blood pressure, help you relax, increase the levels of digestion. So both of these systems are constantly in balance with each other. Sometimes the sympathetic nervous system takes over a little bit more. Sometimes the parasympathetic nervous system takes over a little bit more, depending on the situation. So some neurologic disorders to talk about would be stroke, interruption of blood supply to the brain, seizures, chaotic electrical activity that comes into the brain. Some of the things like dementia, Parkinson's, we may talk about if we have time. Paralysis is obviously something we have to talk about because we're going to talk about spinal injuries. These are the things that we're trying to prevent in our course as an EMT. Okay, so the skeletal system, really, the textbook may describe it as two different systems, the skeletal system and the muscular system. Sometimes it refers to as the musculoskeletal system. They work hand in hand. The skeletal system consists of 206 bones. It can be divided into the axial skeleton, which includes the skull, the spine, the column, the rib cage, everything in the center of the skeleton, and then the appendicular skeleton, which involves the extremities and the pelvis. There are different types of bones. There's flat bones, irregular bones, long bones. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about specific injuries. The skull is pretty much an important structure to be familiar with because of all its intricate structures and what it houses and protects, most importantly, the brain. The spinal column is an intricate part of the skeletal system because, again, it houses and protects a very important organ, the spinal cord. The spinal column is a series of about 33 irregularly shaped bones called vertebrae, which forms this S-type structure in the back. This S-type structure helps give support to not only the spine itself, but support this 8 to 10 pound bowling ball you have on top of your shoulders called your head. Now, the spinal column is reserved into 5 different segments. The first 7 vertebrae, going from superior to inferior, are your cervical vertebrae, which protect the neck. The next 12 vertebrae in the upper back of the thoracic region are your what's called thoracic vertebrae. The next 5 vertebrae on the lower back are called your lumbar vertebrae. The next 4 to 5 vertebrae are fused together and make up the back of the pelvis, and that's called the sacrum. And then finally, another 3 to 4 vertebrae at the bottom of the tailbone, which is not really appreciated much in human beings, is called the coccyx. The 2 areas of the spinal column that are most easily injured are the cervical vertebrae and the lumbar vertebrae. That's something you want to know for future reference. The reason these areas are so delicate is because, or so prone to injury, is because they're very mobile. There's very little stability. The neck is very, very mobile. It can rotate in a number of different directions. So can the lower back. The thoracic vertebrae are less mobile. They're surrounded by big, bulky muscles and the rib cage, so they don't move as much as the other two structures. And some of the skeletal problems we'll be talking about during the semester are fractures, broken bones, dislocations when a bone comes out of place, other things like strains, sprains, bruises. If we have time, we'll talk about things like osteoporosis and cancer, more metabolic problems with the skeletal system, and then the muscular system itself as well. For our purposes, there's 3 types of muscles in the body. There's what we commonly think of as skeletal muscle, which is under conscious control or voluntary control. And the job of the skeletal muscle is to create locomotion, is to move the organism of the human body from place to place. Smooth muscle is involuntary. It's found in the lining of hollow organs like the esophagus, the stomach, the blood vessels, the intestines. And its job is to transport things throughout the body, like food through the digestive system, blood through blood vessels, things of that sort. And then, oh, Dan, what's up? You want to take a moment to?
How's it going?
The immortal Dan Armstrong. The omnipotent Dan Armstrong. Everybody bow. We're not worthy. We're not worthy. Okay, Dan. Hey, you got something to say? I'm not hearing you. Is anybody else hearing Dan?
Sorry about that.
He's
I was on
actually
mute.
typing.
I just wanted to give an update on those that owe me course applications. Try to get them to me as soon as possible. I need to get them by Monday. Sound good?
Is that it?
And then,
okay, Melody approves. Dan, I think you're talking, but I don't hear anything. Is anybody else hearing Dan, or is it just me?
don't know why my thing keeps going on mute on me. I don't know why. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah, it automatically keeps going on mute. Maybe it's trying to tell me something. All right.
Wouldn't it be
So if
great
your
if you
name
could
was in
just
the
press
chat,
somebody's mute button?
maybe. If your name is in the chat, that means I need a course application for you ASAP. So just try to get it to me as soon as you can, especially if you have to mail it to me. So print it out, scan it, sign it, send it to me. Any questions for me before I get out of here? Got it from you. Oh, I didn't get a chance to print yours yet, Jay. Yes, you can email it. So darmstrong@qcc.cuny.edu. My email address is in the contact information tab on Blackboard.
Cheyenne, we're gonna have to set up a time to catch you up to everything.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that another time. I'll let you guys get back to what you're doing.
All right, Dan.
Cheyenne, my phone number is in the contact information too. Just give me a call tomorrow and we can talk about things. All right, guys. Have a good night. Remember, we have a test coming up.
Yeah, I told him. A nice one, too. Lovely test. It's one of my favorite tests. All right, Dan. All right, guys. So to go back to what we were talking about, there's 3 different types of muscles in the body. There is skeletal muscle, which we most commonly think about, smooth muscle. And the third type is cardiac muscle, which is only found in the heart. And it's kind of peculiar about cardiac muscle. It's interesting because whereas skeletal and smooth muscle need to be contacted by the nervous system to do their things, to contract, theoretically, heart muscle can be taken out, disconnected from the body, theoretically, I say. And if it's provided enough nutrients and oxygen, it can actually sustain its own contraction independent of the nervous system for a given length of time, like something you would see out of a cheesy horror movie. But we'll address that when we talk about cardiac emergencies. So that process, by the way, is called automaticity. Automaticity. You don't have to know that right now, but you should learn it at some point. Just go over some of the more mundane organ systems. The digestive system is obviously an important organ system to bring nutrients into the body to support metabolism. And it consists of all the structures from the mouth and the nose to the esophagus, to the hollow organs of the stomach, the small intestines where absorption occurs, the large intestine, which begins the process of elimination, to the anus and the rectum, where waste materials is eliminated from the body. It's also important to understand some of the accessory muscles of the accessory organs of the digestive system as well. The liver, the pancreas, the gallbladder, those all play a part as well too. And we'll have a whole lesson on digestive system emergencies or abdominal emergencies, which pretty much entails the whole digestive system. We'll talk about things about trauma to the abdominal area, digestive system abnormalities such as internal bleeding, appendicitis, pancreatitis, all that good stuff. The integumentary system consists of the skin. It is not just the skin, but it also consists of other structures as well. It consists of the epidermis, which is the outermost layer of the skin, the dermis, which consists of all the real functional organelles of the skin, the sweat glands, the hair glands, the blood vessels, the nerve endings. And then there's a layer underneath the dermis, which anchors it to the overlying structure called the subcutaneous layer. Some textbooks refer to it as the hypodermis. When we talk about soft tissue injuries, we're going to talk about trauma to the integumentary system, anywhere from lacerations, cuts, to burn injuries, and things of that sort. And I hope you guys have strong stomachs because there will be some very graphic photos involved. The endocrine system is an interesting organ system because whereas the nervous system regulates the activities of the body very quickly, so does the endocrine system, but the endocrine system does it in a more prolonged time-release fashion, whereas nervous system responses are very quick because they're based on electrical activity. endocrine system activities occur over the course of days to weeks to even years, involving structures called glands and hormones. Hormones are chemical messengers that go from one part of the body to the other to exert their influence. It's kind of interesting that endocrine abnormalities make some of the more interesting medical pathologies out there. For example, does anybody know who this person is? What was, I should say? Really? Yeah, Andre the Giant. Andre the Giant. You saw him in the movie The Princess Bride. Very popular in the 70s and 80s, and his claim to fame was his gigantic stature. And what happened was he had a tumor in his pituitary gland that caused him to secrete excessive amounts of growth hormone. So much to the point that when he was just a young teenager, he was already over 7 feet tall. And then finally, when his growth plates finally closed off, that growth hormone still continued to be secreted and would cause that very large stature. You see the very large, disproportionate features of his face and his hands. And that was his claim to fame. He was about 7'4", I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and over 500 pounds, I think, at some time, which made him a great wrestling attraction. Unfortunately, the condition that gave him his claim to fame was also the condition that killed him. He died at 47 of heart failure, and basically because his heart was stretched out beyond the means to which it could work properly. I bet nobody's going to know who this guy is. He's a comedic actor back in the 70s. If you ever saw the movie Young Frankenstein, his name was Marty Feldman, and his shtick or his claim to fame was those big googly eyes that he's got there. And the reason for that is he had a condition called Graves' disease, which was a hyperthyroid condition, and he used that to his advantage in his movies and such. Another interesting condition you see here is something called Cushing's disease. So these are the two same children. Now, this is not some kid who's just been fed too many Oreos and Twinkies. This is a kid that has an endocrine abnormality where his adrenal glands are pumping out too much cortisol hormone and causing all this excessive deposits of fat in the face and swelling, and ultimately can cause heart disease and heart attacks in kids as young as 8, 9, 10 years old. But the main issue, main endocrine abnormality we're going to run into at our level is by far diabetes. I'm going to have a whole talk on how diabetes works, how to recognize the emergency of diabetes, and how to address diabetic emergencies as well. Next organ system to be concerned about is the urinary system, consisting of the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder. The urinary system is very important for regulating not only waste material and eliminating waste material out of the body, but also maintaining adequate fluid balance and adequate electrolyte balance as well. When there's abnormalities in the renal system, that can cause all sorts of disease and pathology. And when we talk about people who suffer from kidney failure and kidney disease, these are some of the sickest people you'll run into in your careers as EMT. Everything you learn as far as textbook signs and symptoms kind of go out the door when you talk about people who have long-term kidney failure as well. So with that, I know this is a very shotgun approach to A&P. Have any questions right now? I'll take a moment before we take a break, and then we're gonna start on the hard stuff. So I'll take a minute for questions. All right, with no questions, I know there's a lot to digest. Let's start back up at 8 o'clock. Take a few minutes, go to the bathroom, get yourself some cane, whatever it takes. No, not deep specifics, no. Basic understanding. You'll need to know deep specifics when we talk about the individual emergencies. All right, we'll start up in a few. Okay, we're back. You guys all with me? Funny, as much as you guys are complaining about this quiz, most of you did pretty good. So that means I only have no other alternative than is to make the next quiz even harder. Gotta bounce this all out a little bit. Just kidding.
Steve, so since I got the test supposedly late, mine has like a explanation point.
Yeah, that's some little quirk about Blackboard. It just means I have to enter it manually. So just be a little patient, you'll get the
Oh,
result.
okay.
Yeah, so I don't know why it does that. I've taken
Alright.
that up with IT. So I just have to open it, click it, and then it'll display. I'll do that by the end of the night. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's go on for the hard stuff. So one of the things that have changed over the course of the years in the EMT curriculum is the understanding of the need for the EMT, not just to be able to do what they're told, to kind of have an understanding of why they're doing what they're told. EMTs are doing more now than they ever did at any point in the last 50 years of the profession. And as such, it really requires more in-depth knowledge of something called pathophysiology, or the study of disease and illness. And so, again, of course, medical schools put whole semesters and years into the course of pathophysiology and pathology. We're not going to be able to, we're just barely going to scratch the surface in the next hour that we have together. But hopefully, by discussing what we can discuss tonight, it'll make learning things such as cardiac emergencies and endocrine emergencies later on a little more understandable and have things make a little more sense. So to start off with the discussion of pathophysiology, we need to really talk about the cell, which, as we said before, is the basic building block of any living entity. The cell can be divided into other structures, but if you divide those little structures out of the cell, you cannot really consider them to be independent living organisms at that point. They're just little machineries or components. So I like to compare the cell almost as to its own independent functional city. Now, different cells have different structures, and this is a diagram of what's called a composite cell. Kind of has the best of both worlds. But if you think of a cell as, say, the island of Manhattan, okay, island of Manhattan has certain structures, certain functions. Manhattan has a border of the East River, the Hudson River, the Harlem River, the Lower Bay, surrounded by water on all levels, just like the cell is surrounded by a membrane. The sac that surrounds the cell, it contains all the structures within the cell. It regulates things that go in and out of the cell, just like you can't get in and out of the island of Manhattan without crossing over the river or coming through the river. You can't go into the cell without passing through the membrane. The membrane is a very important component of the cell. It's one of the most delicate and intricate components of the cell. Where was I going with that? So we'll talk about a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So just like any other city, the cell has its own control center, just like City Hall. That's called the nucleus. The nucleus basically determines all the activities of the cell, what that cell is meant to do, how it works, how it operates. It has its own powerhouse, its own Con Ed, so to speak, the mitochondria that takes raw supplies and converts it into energy in the form of ATP. It has its own factories, such as the Golgi bodies and the ribosomes, which manufacture proteins and refine them as well. It has its own transport system, called the endoplasmic reticulum. It has its own infrastructure, the cytoskeleton. It has all these little organelles working together to keep it functioning independently. And like I said, the cell is mostly composed of water, and it's mostly surrounded by water. And the water in the whole body can be found in one of three spaces. Most of your body's fluid is found within the cell itself. extracellular fluid. The other two components, or the other two places where water is found, is in your blood vessels. That's considered the intravascular component, or the plasma of the blood. So, and then there's a space in between the blood and the cell itself called the interstitial space. So if you think of a cell as a bunch of little bubbles floating around in water, that water that the bubbles are floating around in would be considered the interstitial fluid, or the extracellular fluid. So the body has a very intricate means of balancing the fluid compartments, keeping enough fluid in the cell versus enough fluid in blood vessels. So as blood passes by through the capillaries, through the cells, and delivers things like oxygen and glucose and other nutrients into the cells, just the sheer force of that blood being squeezed through the capillary is going to squeeze some of the fluid out of the blood, the plasma, into the extracellular space, or the interstitial space. And as if that blood travels past that space, it's going to pull that fluid back in at some point. And the force that generates the fluid getting squeezed out of the capillary is called hydrostatic pressure. It's just simple force, squeezing that fluid out. What brings the fluid back into the cell is something called oncotic pressure. And what allows for oncotic pressure, or what allows for that fluid to get pulled back into the cell, is the action of these proteins that are floating around in the plasma that work almost as like a magnet to pull fluid back into the blood cells. These proteins are, for the most part, developed in the body's liver. These proteins are known as albumin and globulin, and you don't have to know the names of these proteins, but it's important to understand that these proteins are very, very important. Because if you don't have these proteins manufactured in the liver, if the liver fails for whatever reason, you're going to have more fluid squeezed out of the capillaries that are going to be brought back in. And then that's going to result in this condition called edema. So what you see here, you see this guy's belly is proportionately much larger than his extremities or even his chest wall. So this is not a fat belly. You see how smooth and shiny it is. This is a belly that's accumulating fluid because he has lost the ability to develop that oncotic pressure to bring fluid back into the cells. So that's because he's suffering from end-stage liver failure. So that balance of fluid is very important in allowing the adequate delivery of oxygen and nutrients into the cell. Again, a process we call perfusion. Because every cell in the body needs one of two things at all times in order to survive and carry on its activities. One is glucose, and the other is oxygen. Glucose and oxygen are brought into the cell, into what's called the mitochondria, to produce energy. Or just like fuel is brought into the power plant, Con Ed, to produce electricity. Without the production of ATP to guide and to drive the activities of the cell will die. Now, the use of oxygen to support metabolism and to burn glucose to produce fuel is called aerobic metabolism with oxygen. Glucose is broken down in the presence of oxygen. And that is a very clean and efficient means of producing energy in the cell. The arbitrary number that you would get is about 36 net ATPs. Don't commit to knowing that number. It's okay. So you got to spend money to make money. So it takes about 4 ATPs to make 36 ATPs in the perfect world when you have oxygen present. Can a cell produce energy when there's no oxygen present? Yes, it can. That's a process called anaerobic metabolism. Now, whereas a cell has oxygen and produces a clean burning fuel, so to speak, and a high energy yield, 36 ATPs, if oxygen is not available, the cell can still produce energy, but through a much less efficient means, a process called anaerobic metabolism. The prefix an, means without. Anaerobic metabolism yields a lot less energy, about 2 extra ATPs. So not very good bang for the buck. Now, the other problem with anaerobic metabolism is that it produces a lot of toxic byproducts. When oxygen is available for glucose to burn into energy, the byproducts are carbon dioxide and water vapor. These two byproducts are very easily eliminated out of the body through the respiratory system and the urinary system, mostly the respiratory system. That's why it's just as important to be able to exhale and release carbon dioxide as it is to inhale and bring in oxygen. Without the presence of oxygen, however, the fuel burning process is very inefficient. And so the byproducts of anaerobic metabolism include something called pyruvic acid and then ultimately lactic acid. Lactic acid is released into the bloodstream and it's very toxic. It can ultimately change the chemistry of everything that is delivered to. It will cause nerve cells to conduct more slowly, muscles to not contract efficiently, break down enzymes, and do a whole host of other bad things to the body. So many diseases alter the permeability of the membrane. Ineffective cell membrane can allow substances into the cell that should not be there. And that's one thing that happens with acidosis, or when there's too much lactic acid available. One of the problems with lactic acidosis is that it breaks down the cell membranes. So things that shouldn't get into the cell, like potassium, enter the cell, hydrogen enter the cell, acid itself enters the cell, too much fluid enters the cells, and then the cell ultimately dies. So one of the most important things about knowing the difference between aerobic and anaerobic metabolism is knowing how do we facilitate aerobic metabolism. How important is it to get oxygen to each and every cell of the body? And that's why we come back with this term, perfusion, which is so important to understand. Perfusion, the adequate delivery of oxygen and nutrients to each and every cell. So to get oxygen and nutrients, mostly oxygen, to each and every cell, what organ systems do you have to have working properly? Well, you definitely have to have, nope, you have it now because I'm presenting it to you now. You have to have an intact respiratory system, an intact airway. You have to have an intact cardiovascular system as well. So perfusion is dependent on bringing bringing oxygen into the body and saturating the blood cells with oxygen, and having an adequate blood pressure to be able to deliver that oxygen to each and every cell. Remember, you have to deliver oxygen to the superior parts of the body, the brain and the face, as well as the dependent parts of the body, the lower structures. You got to be able to work against gravity. That's why it's very important to have an adequate blood pressure. Oxygen saturation is a product of having a patent airway from the mouth, the nose, the trachea, the lungs, to the alveoli, and a functional blood pressure, which includes cardiac output and good blood vessel tone. We'll talk about that in a moment. So the textbook refers to the intertwining of the cardiac and the respiratory system as the cardiopulmonary system. There really is no cardiopulmonary system. It's more of a theoretical term talking about how the interaction with both of these systems is critical to maintain this perfusion. And so to start off with, you need to have an adequate airway. So one of the first things and most important things that will disrupt perfusion is a blocked airway. So for somebody who's choking on a foreign body, shoot off a big piece of steak, to somebody who's got a swollen trachea from anaphylaxis, to someone whose respiratory passages are inflamed and blocked, COVID, will not be able to eventually perfuse because that oxygen will not be able to get through the airway and into the bloodstream adequately. So that's why the respiratory system has to be working efficiently and without blockage. There has to be no barrier between the airway, the conducting structures, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli. And then there ultimately has to be a network of capillaries from the cardiovascular system surrounding the alveoli to be able to pick up that oxygen. And again, just to recap the mechanics of breathing, remember, two major muscles of inhalation are the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. When the signal is released for the lungs to expand, the diaphragm contracts, the intercostals contract, and they open up the chest cavity, allowing a decrease of pressure in that closed area to suck in air from the atmosphere, delivering oxygen from outside to inside. And then the release of oxygen or release of air from the chest cavity is just due to the natural springy recoil of the chest, bringing itself back to its normal shape once that signal is completed. So you need to have a little understanding of the mechanics of breathing. As we take a breath in and out, a certain volume of air has to be brought into those lungs with each breath in order to do the job. We call that the tidal volume, the amount of air that's brought into the lungs with each breath, in and out. Typically, we refer to it at about 500 milliliters. Again, not going to hold you to that number to memorize. More, I would like you to have is an understanding of how that works. So every time you're taking a breath in and out, you're moving about 500, give or take, milliliters of air in, 500 milliliters of air out. Obviously, someone who's a lot smaller is going to take less of a tidal volume. Somebody who's a lot larger is going to have a larger tidal volume. So it's important to understand that you have to have a certain amount of volume of air with each breath in order to maintain adequate perfusion. On top of that, you have to be breathing a certain amount of times a minute to get enough oxygen into the body to do the job. So when we multiply the tidal volume plus breaths per minute, we get something called the minute volume. So just look at the math for a moment. You're not going to have to do math problems for the test, I promise you that, but you have to have an understanding. So with each breath, you're getting 500 milliliters of air in a breath. You multiply that by 10 breaths per minute. And your minute volume, the amount of air you're breathing per minute, is somewhere along the lines of 6,000 milliliters a minute, or 6 liters per minute, if you understand metrics. That minute volume is a very important determinant to understand if your patient is breathing adequately or inadequately. Now, just like any algebraic equation, if you take off from one end, you need to add something on the other end in order to keep it balanced. So some people, if they are breathing, some people breathe a little less than 12 times per minute, maybe 8 to 10 times per minute, but they're breathing at a much deeper volume. So instead of 500 milliliters per breath, 600 milliliters per breath. If it balances out that equation, then they're compensating and doing well. If they cannot balance out that equation, if they're breathing too shallow and too slow, then they are what's called respiratory failure. They are breathing inadequately. And that needs to be addressed and corrected quickly before that person dies. If you had CPR, you learned about rescue breathing and assisted ventilations. This is a case when somebody may need assisted ventilations. Now, this is very, very numerical. This is very, very superficial. We're just going by the numbers. Obviously, sometimes people are very relaxed. They breathe at a slower rate, a slower volume, and they get the job done perfectly. This is just to give a little bit of perspective to the numbers. Okay, so tidal volume times respiratory rate equals minute volume. At the surface, minute volume is very, very important for understanding if a person is breathing adequately versus inadequately. When we talk about patient assessment, we'll talk about other factors to include in that assessment. So remember what we talked about the airway. The terminal component of that airway is the alveoli, these little membranous sacs, hollow membranous sacs that allow for oxygen passage to go into the bloodstream. Alveoli is pretty much useless if it doesn't have this functional, intact network of capillaries surrounding it so it can bring oxygen into the bloodstream and conversely dump off carbon dioxide for elimination. Doesn't matter if you have this intact or not if the brain is not controlling the respirations adequately. The part of the brain that controls respiratory rate and volume is found at the bottom, the base of the brain, called the brain stem, or more specifically, the medulla oblongata. If you know the brain stem, that's good enough. Person can survive major injuries to the outer components of the brain, the cerebrum, cerebellum, but you really can't survive any major trauma to the brain stem because that's where the vital functions of the respiratory system sit. So a major stroke affecting the brainstem will affect the body's ability to breathe adequately. Effects of things like narcotics, which dampen and dull the effects of the brainstem, will affect a person's ability to breathe adequately. And a whole host of other things as well will blunt a person's respiratory response. And if that's not taken over manually by the trained EMT, person will die. So what are some other issues that can cause respiratory dysfunction? Well, disruption of pressure. We talked about how those two major muscles cause the chest cavity to expand and suck air in from the outside. That's all due to an imbalance of pressure. I know that sounds like a bad thing, imbalance of pressure. We always want balance in our life, right? We want to bend like and all that stuff. But actually, no. We want that imbalance of pressure so air can move in and out. When everything is balanced out, nothing moves. So one problem is if we stick an ice pick in somebody's chest cavity, now we've given them an additional point of entry for air to enter the chest, balancing out those pressures. Problem is, air's not going where it's supposed to be. So that balance of pressure is disrupting the chest's ability to ventilate or to physically move air in and out of the lung passages. So in order for respiratory system to work adequately, you have to have three processes occurring and occurring properly. You have to have ventilation. In other words, you have to have the adequate physical movement of air in and out of the lungs. You got to be able to take a breath in and take a breath out. Examples of things that would disrupt that process would be FBAO, foreign body airway obstruction, a crushing chest injury, something like polio, which paralyzes the nerve's ability to tell the muscles to contract. Anything that physically prevents the chest from expanding and contracting will hamper or inhibit ventilation. That can be compensated for by taking over ventilations with a BVM or mouth-to-mouth or rescue breathing, whatever case you have. Then you have to have the process of diffusion. You have to have the ability for oxygen to go from high concentration in the alveoli to low concentration in the bloodstream. I'm sure you learned about diffusion in high school biology. It's just a natural chemical process of molecules from high pressure to low pressure. Well, what would inhibit the molecules of oxygen from going from the alveoli into the bloodstream? Well, what if we lessen the concentration of oxygen in the alveoli? What's a situation where that might happen? Well, anybody like to live up the side of the mountains where the air is nice and thin? That might cause a problem with diffusion in respiratory passages. Another problem that might occur as far as getting oxygen to diffuse from the alveoli into the capillary or through the alveolar capillary membrane is if there's a bigger space between the alveoli and the capillary. Let's say there's fluid in between those spaces, in the interstitial fluid, something called pulmonary edema, where the oxygen has to travel a greater distance to get from the alveoli to the capillary. That can cause a problem with diffusion. If you have swelling and inflammation of the alveoli in the walls itself from mucus or other inflammatory mediators, thickening the wall of the alveoli, that will make it difficult for oxygen to diffuse or pass through that wall. What can we do about that? Well, we can try to provide a greater concentration of oxygen. When you breathe room air, you're breathing in about 20% oxygen. Most of the rest of it's nitrogen. If we give additional oxygen, which we'll learn about next week, or actually, Wednesday, we can give a person almost 100% oxygen. 100% oxygen is going to have a little bit of an easier time getting through that barrier than 21% oxygen. It's just a matter of physics. Then the last problem to overcome in order for a person to breathe properly is something called perfusion. So if I got the chest mechanics going, I'm getting air in and out, no problem. There's no barrier between the alveoli and the capillary. It doesn't do me any good if I don't have any blood picking up that oxygen from the alveoli. So I have to be able to perfuse or deliver blood to the alveoli in order to pick up that oxygen and drop off that carbon dioxide and then bring that oxygenated blood back to the heart. What can stop that from happening? Well, a big blood clot in the lungs that are blocking blood flow to the alveoli is one problem. And that's been, again, a big issue with this coronavirus pandemic. One of the biggest complications of COVID is the development of blood clots, which leads to this condition called pulmonary embolus. We'll talk about that later. Or what if I just don't have any blood? What happens if somebody stabbed my aorta or my vena cava and I'm bleeding out, either externally or internally, and I don't have enough blood to be delivered to the lungs? That's going to cause a problem with perfusion as well. So we have to understand all of those factors when assessing somebody's ability to breathe oxygen into the body. Now, at some point, the body attempts to compensate for gas exchange deficits. The body has what's called chemoreceptors, or little sensors in the aorta, in the carotid arteries, and in the brain that are constantly monitoring for changes in oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. You know, an interesting thing is you would think the stimulus to breathe would be lack of oxygen. It's actually not. In a normal, healthy individual, the body is more responsive to increase in carbon dioxide than it is decrease in oxygen. Your oxygen levels can go very, very low before your brain starts sensing something is wrong. But it only has a very little tolerance for changes in carbon dioxide. Too much carbon dioxide accumulating in the blood causes a very acidic environment in the brain, and the brain responds very quickly. So that's something you might want to know for the test. So it's not necessarily oxygen level, it's carbon dioxide level. When you talk about people who have certain respiratory diseases like COPD, that changes, but we'll talk about that during respiratory emergencies. So let's go back to understanding the other organ system that's responsible for perfusion, the cardiovascular system. First of all, knowing the components of blood. What part of the blood is mostly responsible for carrying oxygen? It's the red blood cells. The red blood cells contain a protein called hemoglobin, which binds to oxygen and carries it through the blood. So in order to deliver those red blood cells to every part of the body, especially the brain, you need to have an adequate blood pressure. So many of you have really had your blood pressure taken in the doctor's office. I'm sure everybody has at some point. Some people may have high blood pressure. Some maybe have low blood pressure, but it's completely normal for them. But what is blood pressure? What is it when you're getting your blood pressure taken? What are they actually evaluating? Well, they're evaluating the amount of pressure exerted on the walls of the arteries as the heart, on the walls of the artery, and we'll talk about the complications of severe elevated blood pressure over a long period of time later on. But what we're measuring is the amount of pressure on the wall of the pipes as the heart's contracting. They have to have a certain amount of pressure in those blood vessels to deliver blood to all the parts of the body, especially the parts of the body that have to work against gravity. Being upright, I have to get oxygen to my brain, and to do that, it's going to have to work against gravity. Water doesn't flow uphill. It needs some type of driving force. For example, if I'm a slumlord and I own a 6-story building, and I have cranky tenants on the 6th floor who are nervy enough to want hot water, I have to have a means of delivering water to that 6th floor apartment against gravity. So what do I need? I need to have a water supply. So I have to have blood in the body. I need to have some way of pumping that water against gravity up to that 6th floor. So I have to have a working water pump, which is the heart, and I have to have intact pipes. I have to have pipes that are not leaking. I have to have pipes that are intact, and I have to have pipes that are not too big and not too small, and that are not blocked up. So I'll talk about what this term BP equals CO plus times SVR in a moment. CO stands for cardiac output, how much work the heart's actually doing. Systemic vascular resistance is the resistance by which the heart has to work against to get that blood moving up against gravity. So once again, perfusion is the adequate delivery of oxygen and nutrients to each cell, dependent on having an adequate blood pressure and adequate oxygen saturation. We already talked about all the factors needed to overcome in order to get oxygen into the airway and into the respiratory system. Now that we've been able to overcome that, we have to address these factors to be able to deliver the oxygen to where it's going to go. We have to, and most importantly, when we think about where the oxygen has to go, most important place the oxygen has to go is where? To the brain. And the brain can't go any length of time without oxygen. 4 to 6 minutes without oxygen, and now you're talking about permanent brain damage, which we want to try to avoid at all costs. So we have to have an adequate blood pressure. To have an adequate blood pressure, we have to have adequate cardiac output, meaning the heart has to be able to deliver amounts of oxygenated blood per minute, but we also have to have a certain amount of peripheral vascular resistance. We have to have blood vessels that are in tone. What do I mean by that? Well, your blood vessels are always under normal circumstances, are always in a little bit of state of contraction. What's causing that state of contraction? The sympathetic nervous system. Now, if those blood vessels have to open up for whatever reason, the sympathetic nervous system is shut down, or at least blunted. If those blood vessels have to constrict for whatever reason, it's due to the sympathetic nervous system telling them to constrict. But they're never completely open under normal circumstances. They're always under a little state of contraction. Why? To allow the movement of fluid throughout those blood vessels. Think of it this way. If I have a big backyard and I want to water my lawn, and I have a garden hose, but I don't have a spout at the end of the hose. I turn on the water and I get a moderate trickle of water coming out of the hose, but I have a whole backyard that I need to fill, that I need to water. How can I get more pressure out of that hose to cover the whole backyard? I only have so much water coming out at some point in time, but I have to cover that whole backyard. Well, I can do one of two things. I can either squeeze the hose a little tighter, which is going to increase the pressure by which that water is flowing through the hose, or I can put my thumb partially over the opening of that hose, basically closing off the diameter, causing more resistance, which allows that water to flow more freely and forcefully. Blood vessels do the same. If the blood vessels were completely open, the heart can put out as much blood as it wants. The blood vessels aren't going to be able to carry that blood, especially up to the brain. The blood vessels have to be a little bit contracted to allow that resistance. That resistance is going to allow that blood to move further and more efficiently through those blood vessels. Now, the blood vessel is closed off too tightly, then it's blocked. The blood's not going to go anywhere. So it has to be a little bit of a happy medium. So that's what we mean by systemic or peripheral vascular resistance. You have to have an adequate amount of vascular resistance to maintain an adequate blood pressure. If something were to knock out the impulse to tell those blood vessels to stay contracted and they all just sprung open, blood pressure would drop. If blood pressure drops, perfusion drops. Perfusion drops, brain cells start dying. What can cause the blood vessels to open up suddenly? Well, let's say we have a big spinal cord injury. And now we basically cut the wire that's carrying the signal that's telling the blood vessels to stay contracted. Well, we cut that signal, boom. The blood vessels spring open, blood pressure drops. So we want to try to avoid that. So as I said there, blood vessels need adequate pressure to make cycle work. Pressure controlled by changing the diameter of the blood vessels. Stretch receptors in the blood vessels are constantly monitoring the pressure needed to carry blood through those vessels. And then those stretch receptors will send signals to the brain, to the kidneys, to the adrenal glands to make compensation. So as you can see here, okay, here is a diagram of a normally filled, partially contracted, nice and toned blood vessel. Here's a representation of a dilated blood vessel. When there's a dilated blood vessel and there's not enough pressure on this blood, it doesn't go anywhere. It stays stagnant, which can cause somebody to faint. Okay? What happens when somebody has a fainting spell because they've gotten bad news? They're shocked to their nervous system, causes those blood vessels to temporarily open up. Blood pressure drops, they get dizzy, they faint, boom. Once they're on the floor, it's usually self-correcting, unless there's other things going on. Other causes of loss of vessel tone can be a result of trauma, infection, allergic reaction. Especially infection and allergic reaction can sometimes cause these blood vessels to become leaky. Remember, blood vessels are not just linear pipes. They're made up of cells themselves. And in between each cell, there's spaces. And if these spaces become leaky, usually due to the effects of chemicals like histamine from a major allergic reaction, blood will seep out of the blood vessel, resistance will drop, blood pressure will drop, and that's a whole issue in itself called anaphylactic shock, which we'll talk about later on, that needs to be addressed immediately. So understand why it's important to have blood vessels that are a little bit constricted and provide an adequate amount of resistance. Let's go back to the heart. Okay, let's talk a little bit about cardiac output. It's very important for the heart to be working adequately. The heart has to beat a certain amount of times a minute. It also has to be able to pump out a certain amount of fluid with each contraction. So the amount of blood that the heart puts out with each contraction is called stroke volume. Multiply that by heart rate, and that's what your cardiac output is. All right, so heart rate, a normal, and I say normal, I mean relatively normal, because there really is no such thing as absolute normal in any field of medicine. Most common heart rate in a healthy adult would range anywhere between 60 to 100 beats per minute, on the average. Of course, people live outside those ranges as well. So if you have a heart rate of 60 beats per minute and a stroke volume of 80 milliliters per beat, then you have a cardiac output of 680 or almost 500, give or take, milliliters per minute. And that's what's basically the person wants to be maintained at, to maintain cardiac output, to maintain blood pressure, to maintain perfusion. If there's a failure of one component, the other component will need to pick up in order to compensate and balance out that equation. Yeah, look at that, Jung. You got my math right. You're right, exactly. I made an error there. It should be 4800. Thanks for picking that up for me. Oh, look at that. I think I was overworked yesterday when I finished this slide. So but you guys get I hope you guys get the point. I'm not holding you to the math because I can't even hold myself to the math. So let's talk a little bit about what's involved with stroke volume. How much blood is ejected out of the heart with each contraction? Well, for one thing, you have to have a strong enough muscle to pump out all that blood, something we call force of contraction or contractility. So if I wind up knocking out a chunk of that muscle from a heart attack, instead of having 100% muscle activity, I only have 40% muscle activity, I'm not gonna be able to put out as much blood with each contraction as I would like to. My force of contraction is gonna be much weaker. So if I have a decreased force of contraction, I'm gonna have a decreased stroke volume, decreased cardiac output, which is gonna lead to a decreased blood pressure, decreased perfusion. Now, if I have a decreased force of contraction because my heart muscle is weak, I'm going to have a lower stroke volume. However, if I can increase my heart rate a little bit, instead of from 60 beats per minute to 80 to 100 beats per minute, I might be able to maintain that cardiac output and balance it out, at least in the short term. What also takes into account for stroke volume is I have to have blood coming into the heart. If no blood is going into the heart, no blood is going to come out of the heart. So if I'm bleeding out from, let's say, a bleeding ulcer or a gunshot wound to the blood vessels, and no blood is getting back to the heart, or not enough blood is getting back to the heart, I may have a very strong, healthy heart, but ultimately stroke volume is going to drop. If stroke volume drops because I'm not getting enough blood to the heart, I have to increase that heart rate to increase cardiac output, to increase blood pressure or maintain blood pressure, to maintain perfusion. That's why when somebody is bleeding or in shock from either internal or external bleeding, one of the earliest signs is an increase in heart rate. Why is the heart rate increasing? Because it's trying to compensate for the decreased stroke volume that's occurring from decreased preload to maintain cardiac output. That's one of the biggest reasons why you see that effect in somebody going into shock. So stroke volume, again, is based on preload, how much blood is coming back into the heart, how hard the heart can squeeze or contract based on its muscle strength, and then afterload is an important component too. If the blood vessels that are coming away from the heart are too wide open, you're not going to have enough peripheral vascular resistance. If they're shut down, if they're blocked for whatever reason, then you're going to have a significant decrease in stroke volume as well. So, for example, if I have an aorta that's congenitally defected, where it's way too narrow, congenital heart disease you see in infants all the time called coarctation, the heart's going to pump and pump and pump, but it's not going to be able to get the blood out efficiently because there's a blockage. And if that blockage is not taken care of, cardiac output's going to decrease, blood pressure is going to decrease, perfusion is going to decrease. People who get older tend to have stiffened valves from the ventricle to the aorta, which don't allow blood flow. It's a condition called aortic stenosis. Nothing you have to know about right now, but just to know that if those valves don't open up all the way, blood's not going to get out efficiently. Cardiac output's going to drop, blood pressure's going to drop, perfusion's going to drop. You also have to understand that you have to have an adequate heart rate to maintain cardiac output. We said that the average heartbeat per minute for most healthy adults is anywhere between 60 to 100 beats per minute. You know, there are many times athletic people that at rest live at 54 beats per minute, 50 beats per minute. I think some of your most conditioned athletes have been documented on record as having resting heart rates of 38 beats per minute. Anything lower than that, though, then you're probably going to suffer cardiac output. And the reason why these athletes can live at their low 40s is because their heart is probably so conditioned that it's squeezing every little bit of blood out with each contraction. It's very, very efficient. It's all a matter of balancing that equation. But just as important as having a What's going on with my slide here? That's kind of weird. Just as important as having a adequate heart rate, if your heart rate is too fast, that's not good either. So if you have a heart rate of 120, 130, it's probably reacting to something going on. If it's 160, 200 beats per minute, well, that's a heart rate that's going like this. The heart needs time to fill up. If it's pumping out faster than it's filling up, cardiac output is going to drop. And that's what happens in the initial stages of cardiac arrest. If you've taken CPR before, you probably learned that when the heart stops, it doesn't initially stop immediately. Usually what happens, it goes to a very, very rapid rate, 200, 300 times a minute. That rate is so fast that the chambers don't have enough time to fill up with blood. And if nothing comes in, nothing goes out. Nothing goes out, nothing gets to the brain, the body passes out, become unresponsive, and then they go into VFib. If you don't know what VFib is, we'll cover that later on. So the entire cardiopulmonary system must work together to maintain life. There has to be a balance between ventilation, which we talked about, which is abbreviated by the letter V, and perfusion, which I still don't know 30 years into medicine why it's abbreviated with the letter Q, for the system to work properly. In other words, you have to have a ventilation perfusion match. You also have to have diffusion as well. But if you don't have adequate ventilation, you're not going to have adequate diffusion. Any breakdown in the system will cause a life-threatening situation. So when you have any breakdown in the respiratory function or the cardiac function, you're going to ultimately get into a state we call shock. Shock is just your outward appearance of what's going on in the inside of the body when it's failing to perfuse. You know, we talked about perfusion being the regular delivery of oxygen and nutrients to the cells and removal of waste products. We use the term hypo. Remember, hypo, decreased or low level of perfusion. There's inadequate perfusion that causes breakdown in the system and can result in a patient's death. Now, we talked about all these factors that can contribute to hypoperfusion. Multiple factors have to come into play to allow for perfusion. Failure of any one of those factors can result in death. So getting back to this condition of shock, and we're going to talk more about shock later on, but right now, to make life simple, not that it's not simple right now, there's 4 categories of shock. There's 4 ways in which shock can kill you: hypovolemic, distributive, cardiogenic, or obstructive. I'll explain. Take the word hypovolemic. Well, again, what does that prefix hypo refer to? Decreased level. Hypovolemic, volume. What do you think volume is referring to? It's referring to either blood or fluid. Remember, majority, about 60% of blood is what? It's fluid. It's plasma. And fluid is also located in the cells and in the interstitial components as well. So if we lose too much fluid or volume or blood, what's going to happen? I stuck a knife into somebody I didn't like. They're losing blood all over the place. So that blood, instead of going where it should be, it's pooling all around the body. It's not getting to the heart. So you have decreased venous return because it's leaking out. Decreased preload to the heart. Decreased cardiac output. Results in a condition called hypotension or low blood pressure. Blood pressure crashes. Perfusion fails. If perfusion fails, oxygen is not going to get to all the organs, most importantly the brain, but other organs as well. Multi-organ failure is going to occur. If it's not stopped and corrected, it will ultimately lead to death. Here's a condition called cardiogenic shock. So let's say we have blood in the system, nothing's wrong, but we have a massive heart attack. Okay? We have a system called cardiogenic shock. So we just talked about that. If the heart is sick or damaged, and it's not pumping strong enough because we threw a clot and we just killed off a big chunk of the heart muscle, cardiac stroke volume is going to decrease, cardiac output's going to decrease, perfusion's going to decrease. If something is blocking the heart from conducting properly and it's beating too slow, heart rate decreases, stroke volume decreases, cardiac output decreases, perfusion decreases. And again, we'll talk more about cardiogenic shock when we talk about cardiac emergencies and when we talk about shock as well. I just want you to have a familiarity with it right now. Obstructive shock can occur when something blocks the blood from going to where it should. So you have blood in the system, you have a heart that's working, but let's say you have a collapsed lung that's compressing on the major blood vessels. That's a form of obstructive shock, a condition we call tension pneumothorax. What happens if you have blood and swelling around the heart sac itself, squeezing the heart? The heart's being squeezed, it's not going to contract properly. That's more of a layperson's term of shock. It's not really a medical term of shock. Another form of obstructive shock can occur, as we mentioned before, a big blood clot in the lungs, physically blocking blood from picking up oxygen from the lungs and delivering it to the heart, can also be a form of obstructive shock. Then you can have a condition called distributive shock. An example of distributive shock is something called neurogenic shock, when a severe spinal cord injury blocks off that signal telling the blood vessels to stay partially closed, and all of a sudden they spring open. Peripheral vascular resistance drops, blood pressure drops, perfusion drops. Another thing can happen when somebody has a severe allergic reaction called anaphylaxis. I mentioned before, when somebody suffers a severe allergic reaction, the body's immune system releases chemicals. One of the most important ones is called histamine, which causes a whole host of reactions, one of which is the leakiness of the blood vessels, which allows fluid to seep out of the blood vessel, decreases pressure in the vessels, decreases blood pressure, decreases perfusion. Now, I'll ask you to really understand the signs and symptoms of shock and the compensatory mechanisms when we talk about shock proper during that lecture. Right now, I want you to kind of have an understanding of the workings of shock, what causes shock, and why it presents the way it does. So that's the most important body system to talk about, the cardiopulmonary system, because really disruption of that will disrupt the nervous system, most importantly the central nervous system, and in that case, a person will die very quickly. But there's other body systems that are important just as well, too. The urinary system, involving the kidneys, the ureters, the bladder, which is involved in the regulation of fluid balance, the removal of waste products from cellular metabolism and protein synthesis, and the regulation of electrolytes in the body, sodium, potassium, glucose, so to speak. So if the urinary system shuts down, a whole host of things can happen. One of which is acids and electrolytes that don't belong in the bloodstream start piling up in the bloodstream and can cause a whole host of problems. Cardiac rhythm problems, mental status problems, just to name a few. What some of the things that would cause an acute kidney shutdown? Well, shock, for one thing. If blood is not getting to the kidneys, or if the body's losing blood, the kidneys are one of the, not the first, but one of the first organs to shut down. Certain types of poisons or toxins can cause the kidneys to shut down. Or what also can cause the kidneys to shut down could be a blockage. Somebody who cannot get their urine out. In older men, prostate problems. In older females, bladder problems, causes urine to back up, overloads the kidney, causes the kidney to swell and shut down. And a whole bunch of problems can occur with that. Disruptions of fluid balance can go the other way too. If the kidneys are overworking or not filtering things or regulating things properly, body can lose too much fluid and become extremely dehydrated, in which case fluid's going to shift from the vascular component, the interstitial component, and out of the cells in order to balance. When the cells start losing fluid, the organelles start dying off. The nervous system is extremely complex and extremely vulnerable to all sorts of pathologies. And when we talk about the nervous system, we're really more concerned about the central nervous system, composed of the brain and the spinal cord. Now, the brain is the most protected organ in the body, both mechanically and physiologically. We'll talk about the protective structures of the brain when we talk about brain trauma, but it's also the most sensitive organ in the body. Kidneys, the liver, they can go up to a half hour to several hours without oxygen and survive, metabolizing anaerobically. The digestive system can go several hours without oxygen, but the brain, as we said before, can only go about 4 to 6 minutes until it starts dying off. And same with glucose as well. Deprive the brain of glucose or oxygen, the effects are seen almost immediately. And there's a whole host of things that can disrupt the proper metabolism to the brain. Such as nervous system trauma, either from motor vehicle accidents, lead pipes to the head, diving accidents, just name a few, karate kicks, but more so medical conditions like stroke, which is the most common cause of neurologic injury as well. Infections like meningitis, encephalitis, other diseases as well. A little bit more abstract for our purposes, but if we have time, we'll talk about it. And some things that's not mentioned here is hypoxia. Hypoxia, lack of oxygen, will cause brain cells to die very quickly. Low blood sugar, hypoglycemia, who usually suffers from hypoglycemia or low blood sugar. People who have diabetes, people who take insulin and don't check their blood sugar and miss a meal. Once that happens, the brain cells can die very quickly. You hear that snoring in the background, by the way. That's my pug. They're very noisy breathers. You either love them or you hate them. I love my pug, but she is pretty noisy, and she farts a lot too. So I'm trying to bear through that while talking here too. Talking about the endocrine system. Endocrine system abnormalities usually don't present acutely, like we would see in emergency medicine, with probably the exception of what we talked about again, diabetes. Talk about diabetes. The major problem with diabetes is getting blood sugar out of the blood and into the cell. I'm going to bypass this slide for the interest of time here. So how does diabetes in a nutshell work? And it's a little more complicated than what we're talking about here. So you get hungry, you eat something, you introduce that food into your digestive system. Your digestive system breaks it down into its macronutrients, into its basic building blocks. And why are you getting hungry? Is because your body is craving glucose, sugar, for energy. So it releases hormones to sense that. So once the digestive system does what it does, it breaks everything down and it introduces glucose into the bloodstream. Well, chemoreceptors recognize that now the bloodstream has an increased level of glucose. Now, what does it do with that glucose? Well, we want to get that glucose into the cell so it can be used for energy. There's one problem with that, though. Glucose, we talked about that cell membrane regulating what goes in and what goes out of the cell. Oxygen goes in and out of the cell very easily. Water goes in and out of the cell very easily. Other nutrients go in and out of the cell very easily. Glucose does not. Glucose cannot normally pass through that cell membrane by itself. Just like you're driving a truck into Manhattan, you cannot cross over the river. You need a bridge or a tunnel. Well, glucose cannot cross over that membrane. So it needs a bridge or a tunnel. Well, luckily, most cells in the body have proteins embedded in their cell membranes that work as bridges or tunnels. Problem is, you got to pay a toll. Just like you have to pay a toll to go through the Midtown Tunnel, glucose has to pay a toll to get through those transport proteins. That toll is the use of insulin. Insulin works like that easy pass, that once it's presented to that protein, it opens up the gate and allows glucose to enter the cell. insulin is not present, glucose is not getting into the cell. And if glucose is not getting into the cell, two things are happening. That cell is using other means of fuel to produce energy, like fats and proteins, and there's complications with that we'll talk about later on. Plus, that glucose starts stacking up in the bloodstream, causing the bloodstream to become thicker and more viscous and like syrup. And that's a problem when we're trying to get that blood and that oxygen to other places like the brain and the kidneys and the sensitive organs. So that can only happen for so long. And now, why is this happening? Well, we're not sure 100% why it happens, but we know what's happening is that in juvenile or early onset diabetes, insulin is produced in the pancreas. And for one reason or another, early in life, the pancreas stops working or stops working efficiently, and it stops producing insulin. The other thing that happens is later on in life, the insulin is being produced by the pancreas, but the cells are not recognizing it, or they're becoming what's called resistance to it. That's the difference between insulin-dependent and non-insulin-dependent diabetes. Pretty much the same effect, just different mechanisms. But if this mechanism is allowed to continue without being corrected for, well, then we're going to have a whole host of complications. The body's got to get rid of that glucose in the bloodstream. And it's going to do it by trying to urinate it out, but that's only going to work so much. If the blood sugar level exceeds the ability to filter out through the kidneys, then we're going to suffer things like stroke, brain damage, kidney damage, all sorts of problems, something called DKA, which we'll talk about later on. Diabetes is a very horrible disease if it's not corrected for. Problems with the digestive system, for the most part, involve one of two things. Either the solid organs like the liver or the spleen leaking blood and causing hypovolemia, or the hollow organs becoming damaged and leaking their contents to where it doesn't belong and causing severe infection and inflammation that can be life-threatening. And one of the biggest problems we'll see with the digestive system is things like internal bleeding from either gastric ulcers, esophageal varices, or sometimes tumors. Most common digestive disorder that we'll come into contact with is usually vomiting and diarrhea. If you have the pleasure of taking a patient who's bleeding in their stool from whatever reason, it's just a nasty ordeal that I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy, but happens in EMS. That's the glamorous job we chose. I'm going to wrap it up by talking a little about immune system disorders. The biggest immune system disorder that will probably come into contact is actually anaphylaxis, or severe allergic reaction. Not just to the point where a person has little sniffles and rash, but to the point where their whole body shuts down. Their airway closes down and their cardiovascular system collapses. What's causing that? It's the body's recognition of something that's not supposed to be there. Hence, the immune system becoming hypersensitive. Well, it's good that the body recognizes and fights off things that doesn't belong there, but sometimes the body's a little too good at what it does. And in an effort to try to keep it out and get it out, the body overcompensates. And that's a condition called anaphylactic shock or anaphylaxis. And that pretty much sums it up as far as what we want to cover as far as pathophysiology. All these concepts will be reintroduced later on when we talk about the specific emergencies. So it's a very shotgun approach that we're talking about tonight. So let's just recap a couple of things here. The volume of air that's moved in and out of the chest in a normal breath cycle is called what? It's called tidal volume. Very good. Plasma oncotic pressure is created when which of the following? Large proteins, globulins. Oncotic pressure, not hydrostatic pressure. Know the difference between the two. Remember we talked about the hydrostatic pressure pushes fluid from the capillary into the interstitial space, and then that's reabsorbed by the large proteins produced by the liver, which pull the fluid back into the vascular space. And we talk about if hydrostatic pressure overcomes oncotic pressure, then we get what condition? Everybody remember? Starts with an E. Edema, swelling fluid. Edema in the extremities, edema in the belly, edema in the lungs. Fluid where it's not supposed to be. Normal drive to breathe, chemoreceptors are stimulated by what? Does anybody remember? You know what? That's keyed wrong. Sorry, Marilyn, you're right. In normal drive to breathe, chemoreceptors, that should be D. That was my mistake. So Marilyn is right. I'm wrong. High carbon dioxide. High carbon dioxide, the brain is much more sensitive to high carbon dioxide than it is low oxygen levels. So that is your answer right there. Again, I was really, really overworked and tired when I was finishing these slides last night at work. Oh boy, here's one. A lot of words. Oh, don't you hate these questions with a lot of words? You were called to a kindergarten class where a boy has fallen while climbing on a playground equipment. The teacher saw him fall in his stomach on a step, hit his stomach on a step. He is sobbing and holding his abdomen. As you assess him, you find his skin is cool, clammy. Pulse is 132. Respiratory is 28. Why is the boy acting this way? Well, I got some choices for you, though. Oh, all right, youngster, very good. But let me give you the choices. Wow, you guys are like really quick to jump on this. Okay, so he's really upset and wants his mommy. You know, that's like what we call in Long Island over here. We call that Long Island Mama's Boy syndrome when he's 40 years old and has his wife and his mother both in the bedside by him. He's embarrassed and is afraid the other students will make fun of him. He possibly has wet his pants and does not want anyone to know. Again, Long Island Mama's Boy syndrome with a 40-year-old, or possibly has internal injuries and is shocked. And I think everybody's got pretty much the answer there. It's possibly got internal injuries and in shock. Here's another long question. Your patient is an 86-year-old male with congestive heart failure. We didn't really talk about that too much, but I want you to kind of understand. He cannot help. He won't help tonight because he cannot breathe and feel like he's drowning in his own lungs. The patient has had several heart attacks in the past and tell you his heart is shot. So what do we know about his stroke volume? It's probably not so good, is it? Patient's cardiac output is likely diminished because less blood fills his heart with each contraction. The preload is diminished. The heart force of contraction is reduced. Contractility is diminished. The pressure in the system against which the heart must pump is increased. Afterload is increased. Or what Jung Suk, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, is right. All the above is true. Very good. All right, and that pretty much wraps it up for tonight. James, okay, I'll try to remember that. That makes it a lot easier. That pretty much wraps it up for tonight. Just gonna hit this button right here. Oops, that's not what I want to do.